Welcome to Wyoming's Health Watch. I'm attorney Jason Oakes, and here you'll learn the most up-to-date information about dangerous drugs, dangerous products, and safety news with hopes that it just might prevent a catastrophe. Let's get started.
Thank you for joining me today. Today I want to do a podcast on what I view and what my firm feels is the top 3 civil litigations of 2019. Especially as we close 2019 and enter into 2020, I find it's always valuable to reflect on what has occurred in the year previously, in some ways to help anticipate what might occur in the coming year. So I wanted to do that today, and I thought we had a pretty good grasp of this. We were fortunate enough, my firm, to be involved in each of these 3 cases, and that's not why I've picked them. I think I've looked at a number of publications, I've looked at a number of submissions, and each of these 3 cases were routinely all among the top 10. And I would agree, and they're significant because they have garnered enormous publicity in a good way that I feel provided and will provide for continued redress for wrongs that have been created in the corporate America, and will hopefully, God willing, provide for redress in the many people that have been injured and hurt, harmed, killed by a number of these situations. But I want to start today with the opioid litigation. That is by far the number one that has been on everybody's list that I've seen, and I would agree with that. Opioid litigation is a massive litigation, and we haven't seen anything like this since the big tobacco litigation in the 1990s. And very briefly, opioid litigation are cities and counties and states and even Indian tribes across the country that have asserted civil claims in an effort to recover much needed money to combat what has become an absolute epidemic amongst our country, amongst every 4 corners of each and every state in our country, certainly including my home state of Wyoming. But it doesn't stop there. There have been places like West Virginia and Ohio that have been referred to as ground zero, which is where this epidemic has just absolutely ravaged communities. The opioid litigation is slightly different than big tobacco, because in big tobacco you had all 50 attorney generals representing their states in that litigation, and that's where it stopped. This is far more broader, because in this litigation there's been not only the 50 attorney generals on behalf of the states, but also the counties have asserted their own lawsuits in the case. The cities have asserted their own lawsuits in the case, and even Indian tribes have asserted their own lawsuits in the case, which is a uniqueness to this litigation that you didn't see in big tobacco. The cause of action that is driving this litigation is public nuisance, and this is really the first time that particular cause of action has been used as a sword by plaintiffs against corporate America. And when the litigation began, no one on either side of the aisle could have foreseen how this was going to play out. But we know now, because there was one case that went to trial. It was in Oklahoma that the Oklahoma Attorney General brought against a number of opioid manufacturers and distributors. Each and every one settled right before trial, with the exception of Johnson & Johnson. Johnson & Johnson in the opioid world is a minor player, but minor is still defined as $1 billion impact, and that's billion with a B. The Attorney General took that case. It was a 7-week-long bench trial before the judge, and the judge ultimately concluded that Johnson & Johnson was responsible for a portion of the epidemic that is ongoing in Oklahoma, and ordered the Johnson & Johnson defendant to pay $572 million in compensatory damages. Now, that number was later reduced to $465 million, only because it was brought to the judge's attention that there was a math error, so that was reduced to $465 million. However, just within the last couple weeks, I did see that the Oklahoma Attorney General, and you don't see this too often, he filed an appeal arguing that the damages were too low. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this one plays out. Johnson & Johnson also filed an appeal arguing that public nuisance was an improper cause of action. In any event, the summary judgment motions that have occurred in the federal litigation before Judge Daniel Polster in Cleveland, Ohio, those have all been denied by Judge Polster. There wasn't a case set for trial in October of this year, and literally on the eve of trial, A number of the defendants settled out on that case, and it did not go to trial. The next one isn't until October of 2020, because there's quite a bit of time we need to wait to see how this plays out. But in any event, opioid litigation, without doubt, takes the number one spot for civil litigations in 2019. Number two, we would argue, is the Roundup litigation. I know many of you have seen it, mainly because there's been so much advertising on TV. But advertising aside, there have been, I can't recall the last time there was a huge product litigation where 3 trials had ended, all with plaintiffs' verdicts that were astronomical. I cannot recall a time. The first trial was in Los Angeles. It resulted in over $200 million award. A huge portion of that was punitive damages. There was a second litigation that occurred in Northern California, up in San Francisco, where the federal litigation is MDL'd, and it resulted in an $80 million verdict, which $75 million of which were punitive damages. And then within a couple weeks of that verdict, there was a third verdict in Alameda County, which is also in Northern California, which resulted in a $2 billion, that's billion with a B, verdict that occurred in that litigation. And that is a case in Alameda. I know the gentleman who tried that case, and he only asked for $1 billion that the jury award in that case. And it turned out there was a mother or a husband, wife plaintiff, both of whom had come down with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and the jury ended up giving them both $1 billion. An enormous amount of that was, of course, punitive damages. So I can't say there has ever been another litigation where that has occurred, where 3 plaintiff verdicts in a row, and there have only been 3 tried, all of which were enormous verdicts. And it was because of those verdicts that has brought to the forefront the dangers of the Roundup weed killer. Now, I can tell you, having been involved in this litigation, and we have a bellwether case set in Illinois for 2020 that is set for trial, that there is that the evidence behind Roundup weed killer and the alleged blood cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, is extremely strong. And the information that Monsanto knew and failed to disclose to the EPA and continues to fail to disclose today is quite upsetting. And I submit to you that is exactly why these enormous verdicts have occurred throughout the litigation thus far. Now, all 3 are on appeal. None of those plaintiffs have been paid yet because the appeals are pending. But nonetheless, they were enormous verdicts, and I think they will either continue as we enter 2020, or Bayer, who now owns Monsanto, absolute mess, if you ask me, if you're a CEO of Bayer. But they're stuck with it now. Would be well advised to try to resolve these cases before there are any more enormous verdicts that come about. Third but not last is I think a unique case. There were no trials in this particular one. You remember the horrific MGM shooting that occurred at the Country Music Festival in 2017. Well, that case came to the courts in 2018 and ultimately maneuvered its way through a year and a half, where it ultimately resolved. MGM paid over $800 million to resolve those claims. There were a number of people who were killed, obviously, in that lawsuit. But what I think is unique is that you're starting to see that there is liability being imposed on entities now when these mass shootings occur. And without question, in civil litigation, there's always an issue of foreseeability. And if you can prove foreseeability as a plaintiff, then you can prove that the entity or the defendant has a responsibility to do something preemptively to protect people against that foreseeable event. And now there's, without question, foreseeability with most major events, with any sort of mass shooting. So that's another area in another lawsuit that I believe, and my firm believes, will have a huge impact on corporations moving forward that are responsible for having events, big events, even smaller events. Hotels will now be charged with making sure that people are not bringing in suspicious items. And in that case, MGM case, and mind you, that was a case where a lot of people and lawyers passed on. They just didn't think MGM was responsible. It was a horrible tragedy, but being able to bootstrap a hotel in for the decisions and choices and actions of somebody who was staying there, nobody thought that we would be successful in doing that. But we were, and when further we got into the case, we discovered that MGM had allowed this gentleman to use their back elevator, their cargo elevator, and he utilized that elevator to bring up over 20 assault rifles. There was a number of times that he would not let anybody in his room. He was there for multiple days, and there was a whole host of information that would have, we argued, created suspicion for any reasonable employee at the MGM. So that case did not go to trial, so we'll never know what the jury would have thought, but nonetheless, we prevailed on a number of motions to dismiss that case. Also got around a unique argument by MGM arguing that it was a terrorist attack and there was immunity as a result of it. But we got around that as well. MGM paid money on that case, and hopefully that will bring some closure for those individuals and families who were either horribly injured or lost a family member in that tragic event. And hopefully it will bring some further safety, impose further safety requirements on events and hotels and similar type situations in the future. I want to shift gears now. Those are the top three: opioids, Roundup, and MGM, that I think will have impact on our entities and corporations moving forward. And it'll also be something to keep an eye out, certainly in Roundup and opioids, as we enter 2020. The two areas that I want to point out as additional areas that I urge people to keep an eye out for that will be very interesting in 2020. There is a lawsuit against Remington right now by the Sandy Hook families, and it's always been traditional that any manufacturer or maker of firearms has immunity in civil litigation. So this is one to take specific note of. And again, this is kind of similar to the MGM shooting case in the sense that there are efforts, and successful ones, now being utilized in court in trying to impose civil liability for these mass shooting events that are occurring all over the country. And the U.S. Supreme Court just this November said it wouldn't take up a bid by Remington to review a Connecticut order where that case is filed, ruling that allowed the families of Sandy Hook shooting victims to sue the gun maker. The High Court's denial will allow the case to go forward. That Remington claims and asserts will lead to just a deluge of lawsuits against the gun industry. This particular suit was, as I said, brought by the families of the Sandy Hook massacre. It was families of 9 of the 26 people killed, and there was also one survivor of the Newton shooting. They assert in their pleadings that Remington advertised the Bushmaster AR-15 rifle, which was used in the 2012 massacre, to civilians as a means to carry out military-style combat missions against their enemies. And they're asserting that this marketing effort is in violation of the Connecticut Unfair Trade Practices Act, which doesn't allow advertising to promote violent or criminal behavior. The Connecticut Supreme Court ruled 4-3 in March that Remington can be sued under the Unfair Trade Practices Act of Connecticut by the victim's family over how it marketed the rifle. So this is going to be one to watch, and it's going to be an extremely unpleasant case for Remington to defend, you can imagine, as it should. And then finally, I've talked about this in other podcasts, so keep an eye out. Go to WyomingHealthWatch.com to listen to more in-depth specific podcasts on the next one. But next one to watch is, without question, the climate crisis litigation. There are a whole host, and when I say a whole host, there are hundreds and hundreds of litigations and lawsuits filed right now against all the big players in the fossil fuel industry. We're talking Exxon, we're talking Chevron and BP, all the big players that we've all heard of. And there's a number of assertions out there that, again, is the public nuisance angle, just like in opioids, asserting that these companies are contributing to climate change, and as a result, they need to pay to help remedy the situation. In these cases, there are so many of them statistically, regardless of your politics, regardless of the side you fall on with climate change, just statistically, there's going to be some plaintiff verdicts on this. And I want to also emphasize that these cases aren't going to get tried in places like my home state, Wyoming. They're not going to get tried in Texas. They're not going to get tried in places that rely heavily on the fossil fuel industry. They're certainly not going to get tried in North Dakota. They're going to get tried in places like Oregon, places like New York, and California, where people are already, in my view, they're already prepared for and ready for the argument that these companies are contributing to climate change. And I think they could be enormous. These will be billions upon billions upon billions of dollars that'll be returned as verdicts. And that sort of publicity will only increase the number of lawsuits that'll get filed against these entities. And at some point, they'll have no choice but to try to bring some resolution to these lawsuits. That's the recap for 2019 and what to look out for 2020. It's going to be a really interesting year. Also, check out my podcast where billion-dollar verdicts will become more the norm as we are envisioning it as we enter 2020 and beyond. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Jason Oakes, and this is your Wyoming Health Watch.